Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. This podcast moves beyond questions of God's existence to ask, what's next in a godless world? Beyond Atheism is produced and distributed by Atheists United Studios.
Jacob L. Wright is a professor of Hebrew Bible at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. He's the author of Why the Bible Began, an alternative history of Scripture and its origins. And he's here today to discuss the book with us. Jacob, welcome to Beyond Atheism. It's great to have you here.
Well, it's good to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Jacob.
Thank you, Nathan and Todd. I'm looking forward to a conversation with you guys.
Oh, we've been looking forward to one with you.
So I think, Jacob, you're probably the first biblical scholar we've had on the show. So I just wanted to ask, just to start off, like how did you become a biblical scholar, and why did you go down that route?
I was interested in religion from an early age because it was an intersection of so many different kinds of intellectual currents. I thought I was going to become a philosopher. At an early age, I wanted to become a professor. So I wanted the big ideas, physics and philosophy and all that. Where would I be able to, do something really big? And I gravitated to religion and the study of the ancient world and kind of getting at the origins. So, yeah.
Well, you picked a pretty big thing to study. I mean, it's just the Bible, the best-selling book of all time. I guess, okay, when we get into something like Bible studies, what does that entail?
Well, biblical studies is a huge field, and it encompasses both professors who are working in seminaries and professors who are working in colleges, atheists and believers, and people who are interested in the historical aspects, and people who are interested in maybe how the Bible has had an impact in society, both for good and bad, and people who are doing constructive theology. So it's a real meeting place, a market of ideas, and it's kind of exciting that way. Some of it gets a little bit weird because you have such very different folks coming together, and the arguments and the argumentation and the evidence and so forth is debated, and it becomes kind of fun for both sides to try to do this kind of competition of proving each other wrong. So that's helpful. But it is a crazy big field, and theology, by the way, if you look at the first universities in Europe, theology was one of the, or if not the first discipline that they had. So it does. One has to kind of look at how religion departments and much of the humanities is being wiped out, but theology is going to have a future because Christianity and Judaism and these religions are going to have a future. And these are professional schools, many of them seminaries, who are training clergy. I'm Jewish, and I work in a Christian seminary, and I train pastors, and they know where I stand on many things, but they really appreciate my honesty and my perspective. And I work in a liberal seminary, so it's not fundamentalists or evangelicals, most of them are not, but they're very open, and they want to learn. Many of them are now nuns without any religion, and they're coming to seminaries to try to figure out, well, how do we create community without having faith at the center or some kind of creed? And I'm all about that, having questions rather than creeds as the center of it, having text and curiosity and the interest to come together to read text and discuss them and debate them. What are they about? And if more religious communities were about that, I think they would be stronger. The attrition rate within online churches is, I think, historically due to that they have these categories and criteria for belonging. So how do you become atheist? You have to believe this kind of Methodist theology. And I appreciate the Jewish approach, where it's not about you have to believe anything. You just have to come to the conversation.
So wait, how did you end up at a seminary? This is
That's crazy. I'm the only non-Christian faculty member. It has not been easy, let me tell you.
But you just said there were also nuns. Are there like meaning non-religious
So that's
at
new.
the seminary? That's new.
N-O-N-E-S, like not religious, right? So it's a new thing. It's just the last few years. And they tend to gravitate to me a little bit. I feel of kindred spirits there. And but a lot of them are religious who want to learn, with me and stuff. So I try to make it hospitable. My classrooms are not safe spaces, but they're hospitable spaces, meaning that it's nothing safe here, but we're going to treat each other with respect and listen to each other, and we're going to practice hospitality.
So take that step back, and how did you get there?
So I went right after my college to Germany, and went to Dachau, to a concentration camp, and was with all kinds of students from all over the world. And then I ended up really liking Germany. Germany has a really unique culture in comparison to other cultures. Austria was very complicit, if not a big part of the Holocaust, but Austria has never confronted its past. And that goes for many countries. Germany has created a new culture around nie wieder, never again. And so they really confront it with courage to accept culpability. And that really made it very cool for me. I ended up staying there, getting my PhD, becoming an assistant professor at the University of Heidelberg, one of the oldest universities in the world. And then it came time, let me say this, as a Jew, I was not allowed to become a professor of Old Testament there. Weirdly enough, they did all kinds of stuff in order to change, but biblical studies is still controlled by the church. You could be a Roman Catholic, Catholic faculties, or Protestant, but there was no space for Jews. So I had to go back to the United States. And that's when I started looking at jobs, and I got some offers. And Emory is a pretty big program. So I'd never been to the South before, and until my interview, and I ended up going there, and I had a lot of regrets at initially being there. It took a while, but now I'm really in love with Atlanta. It's just the weather and all that. And then, about 8 years ago, Germany created the first professorship for a Jew teaching the Bible, Hebrew Bible. And I landed that job. It was in Potsdam. And I ended up turning it down. It's...
Wow.
It's basically because of the weather. I love Potsdam and Berlin and so forth. But after about 10 years of living there, I got so depressed. You can go for months before you see the sun. And I was like, this is really a great culture, but I'm not quite sure I want to put up with that weather. So, but I turned down the offer, but it was great to receive it because it was historical, and I kind of put that as a feather in my cap. And maybe I'll go back one day.
No, that's fascinating. Why don't we turn to the book in question? And maybe we can just start very basic. When you talk about the Bible, you mean the Hebrew Bible, I guess, or the Old Testament as it's called. Maybe just talk about what is it exactly? How do we know? Yeah, maybe it's more complicated than maybe people imagined.
Yeah. So let me say this. A lot of my students who are going to become pastors, when I ask them what the Bible is, they talk a lot about the New Testament, but the New Testament is not the Bible. And that's hard. That may be not the case for 20th century, 21st century. So the Bible is what one treats as the Bible, right? But if you look at the New Testament authors themselves, the New Testament consists of all these Gospels and writings of the Apostle Paul, in this weird book of Revelation, and some other kinds of stuff, apocryphal works, but whatever, it is all the writers, without exception, I think this is fair to say, did not consider their writings to be the Bible. They would say, as it is written. or as Scripture teaches. What was the Bible for them? It was the Old Testament. And and I have to impress this upon my students, the New Testament is an appendix to the Bible. It's not if you were to ask Paul, is your writing on par with the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Absolutely not, he would have said. That's the Bible and other things, but what I'm doing is help people understand it. So what is the Bible per se? And that is this corpus of literature, the Jewish scriptures, that consist of the first 5 books, which are ascribed to Moses. Moses, of course, did not write them. It ends with Moses talking about him. Moses was the humblest man who ever lived. Of course, Moses that, and then he talks about his death. But for some weird reason, it becomes attached to that Moses is the author. Then it goes on with the kind of what happens after the first 5 books. Moses dies in the Torah. He doesn't enter the promised land. And then the story goes on all the way up into the formation of these kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the story continues until they're destroyed. It ends with their defeat. It begins with these auspicious origins, like the great liberation from Egypt and so forth. But it goes downhill. And that's a very weird narrative, because you would expect a national narrative to begin with we were nothing at the beginning, and then as the phoenix rose from the ashes, we now, and it ends on a happy ending note. But that's not the case. It's flipped. They flipped the script. And that's what makes it, I think, to get to the heart of my thesis. That flipping of the script is what makes it so powerful. It ends with defeat. It really foregrounds defeat, the trauma inflicted by empires, the world's first empires, on these small communities. And these small communities of the Judeans in the south and the Israelites, or the northern kingdom in the north, they had to come to terms with that. And it's not that the whole population thought in a certain way. They were not biblically minded. This is a minority report from some scribes who we know nothing about, anonymous scribes, and it's just so multi-layered and so many perspectives, and you have to imagine like a rolling corpus where one story gets read and then added to it over generations, and it's really evolutionary, not somehow kind of one authoritative person writing this. And
wait, now, Jacob,
yes,
are you speaking in terms of your analysis of it, or is this what you were taught the Bible is?
Okay, that's helpful. No, this is my shtick. This is my approach to it. And let me back up and say that my question, why the Bible began, by the way, not choice for the title. It was from the editors and the publisher. But anyways, I'm trying to explain why we have a Bible in the first place.
Yeah.
And if you were to ask people of that, they would say, religious people would say, well, it's God's revelation. It's what God wants us to know. And then you would say, well, that's fine. Why do we have, I'm looking out and I have these plum trees outside. Why do we have plum trees? Well, God wants us to have plum trees. No one would be satisfied with that. They would probably look at the more immediate causes, okay, this evolved from that a little bit. Even religious people would say that. But when it comes to the Bible, they just don't want to ask that question.
Right. It's a weird question. I don't think I've heard it posed before.
It hasn't.
But it's just kind of accepted as it is. It's there because it's there. So it's just very...
It is kind of the first book to ask that question. And let me say my colleagues shy away from it because they're not because they're religious, but because it gets into a tricky area of intentionality.
Yes.
Meaning, we can tell you about the what, the where, the who, the when, but the why this happened, that gets into kind of, you really have to come up with it becomes speculative perhaps for them. And I'm trying to show it doesn't have to be speculative. And they would say also, a lot of colleagues or a lot of secular people who are not treating this stuff as scripture, they would say, well, it's a religion. And religions need writing, scriptures. But that's not true at all. Most religions, if not all religions in the ancient world, were not formed around text. They were formed around sacrifices and rituals, different kinds of things, but texts were not sent. And so it just pushes the question back. Why do we have a Bible? And what I'm trying to get at is it wasn't originally scripture at all. It was an attempt by scribes to connect various past and say, your past and your past and your culture and your history and your heroes and so forth. You know what? It all goes back to one family and we have one story. I compare it to actually Germany before the unification process, right? Germany is a late unification, which actually is why it becomes kind of fascist. But you had so many principalities and different kinds of duchies and so forth, and they maybe spoke a similar language, dialects and so forth, but it took a long time for them to start seeing all of their diverse past as one German past. And that was the work of intellectuals to say, we're a German people, and when we tell you the history of Bavaria and tell you the history of Baden and Württemberg and all of these things, it is the one story of one people. And as historians, we say that's not quite true. That's political program. And it is the case of the Bible too. But these German historians are also learning from the Bible that very thing. And that is a way to use text, to use memories, collective memories, a political agenda of mobilizing, bringing people together. And the difference between nationalists doing that, whether Italy is another case, the unification of Italy, the difference between what they're doing in the modern period and what the biblical authors are doing in their own time is that in the modern period, these guys are mobilizing a nation for liberation, for conquest, for political assertion, for some kind of statehood, is what I would call it. Statehood,
yes.
Some kind of political power.
Which is something you differentiate this between the nationalism of the modern period, and I think you mostly refer to the Bible as people making.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
nationalism, I would say, is with a political agenda of mobilizing various populations, bringing them together to create some kind of political force, like I said, for liberation or to assert itself in relation to other competing political communities. So the nation states, we call them. There's the state. The state is something that can be destroyed. It's the border, it's the government. The nation is the people. And we use the word nation for the government often, but that's really a misnomer. Nation is just a state of mind, I call it. It is really, going back to Ernest Renan, this kind of, what is a nation? What is a people? It is the will to be together. And it's really intangible. And it thus requires some kind of collective memories and a will to be together.
But now, and this is what's really fascinating about it, because when you look at the mostly 19th century nationalist movements, what you see are states centralizing control, and then they start institutionalizing the idea of the nation, right? That they have a state that they're trying to unify. They have an education system. They're standardizing language. They're unifying the economy, and they're doing it with things like mass media, literacy, things that just simply don't exist 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. But you're saying that that's what the Bible was doing.
So Todd, I like that
with intention
question, because you hit right on a central point. So with political theorists, they will push back against me and say that the Bible is the first project of nationhood, because they say nationhood requires mass communication, mass transit, the unified education and economy. And they're not primordialists. Primordialist within the realm of political theory is that nations are old, and it's an older concept. And what I'm trying to show is that actually the first nationalist within the modern period, while looking to ancient Israel, like Herder, the first kind of nationalist thinker in Germany, he was a theologian, and he read the Bible, and he uses the Bible to kind of like show how Germany can do the same thing. But what I wanted to say just a second ago is that they, like Herder, maybe not specifically Herder, but a lot of it like Fichte and these guys who are nationalism, the emergence of nationalism is really with a vengeance to kind of assert itself on the international stage. What the biblical authors are doing is they're creating this nation in order to come to terms with the loss of statehood, with defeat. And they're not saying we're going to come together in order to rise as a phoenix from the ashes, in order to like reassert ourselves, but rather to survive in a world of empires in which we don't have statehood. And we can be a people without a state. We can be a nation without a state. They're not about nation states. They're about nations without states.
Without states. And did you find that explicit in the Bible? Do you
Yes.
think that there's a part of that saying like we don't need a state, or that
Yes.
we are stateless people?
Yes,
Really?
I do. And a lot of people are going to push back, I guess, my colleagues in some ways, and saying, "No, you're ascribing intentionality to this, and you're trying to read the narrative in a certain way, and you're doing something constructive, and it's not really descriptive." And I say that's not true at all, because what we have in the narrative is, so as I pointed out, we have this whole narrative that begins with the creation of the world and it ends with destruction. And the turning point is the emergence of kingdoms. So if we were to look at it and divide it into thirds, 2/3 of the whole narrative is about pre-statehood. And then you have that David and Solomon and the divided states and all of that. And they're saying we were a nation. They don't use the word nation, but it's pretty much, it's people. We were a people long before we were ever a kingdom. They don't use the word state and they don't use the word nation, but just because they don't use it doesn't mean we as modern scholars can apply that. The emic versus etic kind of distinction. The emic is the way people describe their own, the narrative, what kind of language it uses. The etic is what we as scholars would use to compare and kind of abstract categories that help us say this is similar stuff. So the emic category is we were a people, and long before there was a kingdom. What is a kingdom? It's a type of state. There are states that are without kings. There are democracies. There are all kinds of city-states and on and on. But they're states. Why are they states? Because they have governments, taxations, borders, standing military, all of that. The contraptions of statehood. And states can be destroyed, right? You can go in and you can wipe out a capital and wipe out borders and destroy armies, the whole infrastructure. A nation is hard to destroy. You would have to do genocide to destroy a nation because it's the people. And so go back to this point. The narrative says we were a people long before there was a kingdom. And so they're doing political theory in narrative form. They're not doing political theory like Plato or Aristotle, where they're sitting back and they're developing these categories, because they're not trying to theorize. They're trying to lay out a blueprint for a future. And the story, the power of narrative is what they're after. They're not trying to do something theoretical. They're trying to do something programmatic. And that's why it's storytelling. But the storytelling is inventing something. Artists, a novelist, do really, way before the theorists come along, the philosophers, they're already doing things that the philosophers come along and say, oh, I'm going to theorize that. So here we have in narrative form, people before state. And what takes primacy? People. The kingdom is going to be destroyed, but after the kingdom is destroyed, one can say, we can still be a people. You know why? Because we were already people before this.
Mm-hmm. Are there similar kinds of groups who consider themselves a people in the same way? Well, I guess a related issue is, whether at what stage we can call these people Jews, I guess, but maybe that's a tangent, perhaps. Maybe we can go down that path.
We can talk about that. But your question about where
are there comparative kind of groups who see themselves in these terms? Because I think one interesting thing, like you talked about, is that there would be archaeological findings in Mesopotamia or whatever, but like for whatever reason, these writings haven't been passed down. It was only, an archaeologist in the 19th century who found it. So I wonder, like, how unique is it what the biblical scribes were
Yeah,
doing
that's a
at the
great
time?
question. And that's what I'm really trying to point out, that this is the first attempt to ask, what is a people? They knew what kingdoms were, they knew what city-states were, they knew what empires were, and tribes and families. Those were common concepts to them. But we're still struggling to define what is a people. We're faced with this in our own political communities, and they don't tell us this is what we're doing. We have to come along once again as theorists and say, let's face it, they're trying to ask what constitutes a people, what do people need in order to survive, and they're discovering things that we would call are very important to nationhood, and most foundationally, education. The whole corpus is what I call a curriculum, and it is to instruct. Throughout this corpus, they're told, teach your sons and daughters this. When they see this monument and they ask, what is this about? You tell them about this and that. You need to learn the laws, and you need to teach them the Psalms, and you need to teach them the Proverbs, and they need to know their history, and on and on. Not mathematics and physics, because it's not about a technical knowledge. It's not about education like scribes for practical purposes. It's civic education, and that goes to the heart of what it means to be a people. To answer your question, whether we have comparative stuff, I don't think so. I mean, the Greeks are not coming up with the concept of nation. They are asserting a different kind of political community as superior to the Asians, right, with their kings. But they're not saying we are one Greek people and we need to come together. Athens is trying to assert itself against Sparta, and on and on. And then when you go to the ancient Mesopotamia, all the text, you really rightly pointed out, all the text that we have, we discovered in the modern period, in the 19th century, like Nathan said. And that is why I think we have a Bible that was transmitted, because it was a text for a people. And as the people survived, they carried that text, as Heinrich Heine from the 19th century, this Jewish poet who becomes Christian, says, the Jews have in their bosom a portable homeland. And that text they carry with them, and that's why these texts survive, whereas the texts of the ancient empires were all about the king, all about the gods who ordained the kings. And then when they were destroyed, it's like, who gives a what about these texts? Because Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib, the great kings of Egypt and so forth are gone. And these are only extolling their might. Well, their might is is no longer the case, and no one went in there to save these texts because they had very little meaning to a people, a readership.
Right. Yeah, and the kingdom itself didn't necessarily have a nation.
The kingdom was just like all the other kingdoms.
All right.
Right? The kingdom, this is not something Jewish or something inherent to ancient Israel that they thought this. A lot of conservative scholars are trying to make that case, and I call bullshit on that. This is really, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah are nearly no different whatsoever from the surrounding kingdoms. Why do we have the Bible? Because of scribes. Because of a group that come together. Their technology is writing. They were paid to write contracts and letters, and it was a technology like any other technology. No, there was no reading community. They never thought that we'd be sitting around reading today. They only thought that it was less than 1% of the population who did this. And therefore, they had to aspire to the idea that there could be a larger readership and that there would be a community centered around text and the people of the book. And that's, I think, so important to emphasize that this is not something that is Israel and monotheism and intuitions. It's a minority report, countercultural thinkers who are trying to push back against the status quo and tell their communities, we have a plan. And this is going to work. And it actually took a long time to catch on.
I want to get more into this plan because there's a couple ways to look at it, and we've touched on a bunch of things, and I feel like it's time to start to put it together. Because when we think about the Greeks, like you were saying, they have different city-states, that's their government. The city-states rise and fall. Inside the city-states, you don't have nationalities, you have citizenship. Citizenship is something based on how people behave and what you do in that city.
Land ownership and all of that.
Right, all that stuff. And they debate, a lot of Plato is debating what citizenship is, and Aristotle and Plato and Socrates are talking about like how we do this. They're constructing this sort of view of Greek democracy or Greek republics. And we can identify it's them, right? It's the philosophers who are constructing this. And when we look at nationalism, we know that all nationalities are themselves constructs, right? They're created, like you were saying, from history, from the culture, the shared stories, the language, the ideas, the beliefs, the behaviors, all of this stuff. And what we see in the Greeks is something it's very much, it is that construction, right? They're talking about, they're posing questions and coming up with answers. In the Bible now I'm curious about where the sort of description of what we were as a people before becomes, this is what we will be in the future. And does that make sense? Like where that line sort of goes, and who's actually, is there someone that's directing this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, are the scribes just sort of stumbling into it and kind of finding?
That's a great question, Todd. And that gets to that like why and that intentionality, and it gets messy. And it's like, was there already a overall plan from the get-go that someone came up with and then everyone kind of fell in line with? And
and then how do you do that? And like, how was the Bible assembled at this point?
I take the second option. They are discovering it as they go.
Yeah. So is it a description?
It's in stages. And but you get to the heart of it, that in Athens, it's all about what citizenship is. That is, what does it mean to be the member of a state, a city-state? Mm-hmm. And this is about, if Athens were destroyed, and then they would ask, what does it mean to be an Athenian? Even when we go into exile, can we be Athenians in exile? Well, what makes an Athenian? Well, Athenians is, we worship this, Athena, or we have this text or languages and all of that kind of stuff. And that's not what's going on in Greece.
No. And in fact, like Socrates says the opposite when he's found guilty, and he can't, and he says, like, I can't leave, I can't go anywhere because then I'm nothing. I'm only, right? I only exist as an Athenian in Athens under the laws.
Yes. You hit the nail on the head there. And thus he commits suicide.
Right. Yeah. Because it is suicide.
Just on as a side note, suicide is totally repudiated within the Hebrew Bible. It is not give me liberty or give me death. It's not statehood at all cost. Jeremiah is facing these people who say, let's go. They're kind of like these radical nationalists who, Babylon's going to come and we're going to die. Let's die with honor rather than go off into slavery. And Jeremiah, the prophet, says, it's better to live a slave than die of freedom. It's the exact opposite. And throughout all these battle stories, no one dies. There's no kind of, after the conquest in Joshua, they don't come together and mourn the war dead like Pericles does in Thucydides, where they have these yearly festivals where they come together and they talk about Athens as the place that people laid down their lives, for this the success of this project, this political project. And that's not what's going on in the Bible.
No, because that's built into the city, and you need to protect the city, but this is, you protect the people, and we are the people.
Bloodshed, sacrifice, and all that is for statehood. You go to the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and it is to the Tomb to the Unknown Soldier, and it's about monumentality and statehood and power. And survival in exile is about learning to compromise, learning not to, give up everything for the sake of freedom, but in basically learning to come to terms with the way things are and surviving to live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And going back to my earlier kind of tangent question, like these states of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, like would the people there think of themselves as Jews at this stage, or when does that happen? Like
It's
how do
right
they
on the
think
head,
about
Nathan.
themselves?
That's
Mm.
when does a Judean become a Jew?
Right. Right.
And the emergence of Jew is related to peoplehood. A Judean is a citizen of the state of Judah. A Jew is like in the book of Esther, Purim is coming up this week for Jews. And we read the book of Esther and they talk about these Judeans. It's the same word in Hebrew, but in English, we distinguish between Judean and Jew. And rightly so, because these are Judeans living throughout the whole empire. They don't want to go back to Judah. They have no intention of that whatsoever, but they're Jews in the sense that they belong to a people without a land. And that's what makes a Jew, a people without a land. And then there are Jews who return, right, in the modern period to establish a new state. But it's very interesting that Judaism and Jewishness within the modern state is, except for some radicals, these religious Zionists, but most Israelis don't have anything to really do with religion, because now it becomes, I'm an Israeli. I am a member of a state.
Yeah.
I fight in the military. And it's about compromise. And, old Israelis are much more willing to compromise than the new kind of religious Zionists who are taking diaspora ethics about survival and then bringing it to a state situation.
Bring to the state.
Really risky.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so did they, I guess the flip side of this is like, I mean, when we talk about Esther in Persia, like she identifies as a Jew by then, correct? She's Judean.
She's Jewish in that sense. She's like, the word once again is the same in Hebrew, but we have to say this is now Jewishness. This is being a member of a people without a land, without a state, a stateless people, a stateless nation.
Do you find, like, when you read the Bible, is there like a section where you feel that sort of sea change from something like, okay, like we've reached where this status of peoplehood is reached? It's not just people wandering through the desert anymore. Now it's, we are Jews and this is who we are and what we do.
Yeah. Okay. So it suffuses the whole thing. There would be no Bible without peoplehood, without defeat, and without Jewishness. So especially in the early parts, we don't use the word Jews for, I mean, Jews talk about Abraham as a Jew, and in a real sense, that's not proper, but in another sense it is, because the whole prehistory, this mythic past, as a preamble to the statehood, it's that we were a people in exile. Egypt is exile. We were outside of our land, and we became a people in the wilderness. The wilderness becomes a metaphor for the exile and before the land. And so they're Jews. The Torah talks about, if you will, Jews being Jewish without being a Judean, without member of a state. So from the get-go, you have peoplehood, and it's without that, there would be no Bible. That doesn't mean that all of the texts are about that, but these older texts have been refrained from this perspective.
Right. And that they are Jews. You start working backwards and putting it on them.
Well, they're taking the memories of the kingdom and say, well, this is memories when there were actually Judeans and citizens of a kingdom. And that's a later development. We're going to bracket that. And we're going to tell you, what's really important, what takes priority is Jewishness, being a member of a nation. And then what happens kind of problematically is that these Jews, if you will, this peoplehood embraces statehood. Statehood brings security. It's not like the Bible doesn't like statehood at all, but it comes at a price. And it's about taking that citizenship kind of concept of being a Judean as a member of the state of Judah and say, that's a later development. It's not essential to our identity. and we have to bracket it so that, after the defeat of the kingdom, we can go back to the way it was before.
Right. It's a thing that happened, but it's not something that necessarily defines you.
Tell me what you mean by that.
That you can, as a people, form a state, but it's not the state that defines you. It's the people
not essential.
It's not part of your character.
It's not essential to the identity. It's really, if you will, icing on the cake. Who doesn't want to have security and your borders and peace? But that's not always going to be the situation. So what are we going to do the day after? And the day after is like the day before, meaning the day before the kingdom. And we're going to go back to that kind of covenantal conception where we come together around a body of written laws. And these written laws are going to define who we are long before a kingdom or a palace or a monarch defines who we are. Where historically it was the monarchy who created Judah and the Judeans. And it took a long time for these scribes to come along and say, there's another thing. This Judean concept is actually a later and secondary development, and it's not essential. And that's counterfactual, counter-historical, but nevertheless very powerful.
Right? But it becomes part of the story. Well, then, this leads to another point, though. And from the atheist perspective, this is something that's very important. Like, if there are parts of the Bible that are not true or are historically wrong, does that matter for constructing your identity? If there's something that's just not true?
Well, I would say that all identities are constructed basically around lies. Why do I say that? Thomas Kwame Appiah. Kwame Appiah is this political theorist at Princeton and at NYU. And a book called The Lies That Bind. Not the ties that bind, the lies. In a real sense, what binds us is fiction. Our fictions, our movies, our art, our historical fiction. And if we and Jill Lepore, working at Harvard as an American historian, it tries to make the case we need good lies. We need good fiction for our nations because when you go the route of we're just going to tell you the way it was factually and historically, you take the foundation for imagining something different than the way it was, and people's need to aspire to something, and they need myths. Being a people is about creating a good myth, and that's why the Bible is very mythical. It's not something that from an atheist perspective one could say the Bible is mythical and thus it's not valuable anymore. And religious people would say that if it's mythical, it's not valuable anymore. And I'm saying because it's mythical, it's so interesting. And that's why it still exists, because it is a program, a vision for something that's going to hold together people, bring communities together, proclaim that they all go back to one family, right? You and you and you, we're fighting each other. But you know what? Our ancestors were all from the same family. We need to learn to get along.
Yeah, actually, one thing that people worry about with nationalism and this sort of thing is kind of the exclusive nature where, there's kind of the binding of the in-group, but then toward the out-group, there can be kind of xenophobia or whatever. And obviously that's kind of the dark side of nationalism and patriotism and so on. But I wonder, well, you talk about this a bit in your book, how is this problem of outsiders and so on tackled in the Bible or the Hebrew Bible?
Well, it's a huge problem. Anytime you're forming a community, you have to ask the question, well, how did new members come in? Are we going to allow new members? And especially within the nation, nationalism has a huge problem with xenophobia and chauvinism and not allowing folks to come in, cross the borders and all that, right? So that's why the biblical texts are kind of interesting, not kind of, but very interesting, is because they have to face that question all the time. And sometimes they land in a realm that I find, at least, and many of us would find very disturbing, right? That they are xenophobic. But xenophobia only gets you so far. You know, the reason why these texts exist, and if something really catches on, it must have things don't catch on and hold for centuries and millennia unless they have some ability to actually, work. And so these texts they take on cases like when Joshua and the Israelites enter Canaan and they're told, like, you need to, like, wipe out all the Canaanites and take the land.
Yeah.
That's really problematic. It's a mythic past. They're not trying to say we should do that in our present, but they're trying to imagine how we entered here, this land, and took it. The first person they encounter is Rahab. Rahab is a harlot. She is in the city of Jericho. And they make an exception for her and her whole clan, which is a large clan, and they say, you're going to be a part of us. So they break the law. They don't maintain the law, and they are allowing her to come in. But on what basis? Loyalty. So those who want to join, and they say, I really want to throw my cards in with you all, with you guys. I want to become a member. That is then allowed. It's like with naturalization processes in our own countries. We allow people to join Canada and America and Germany and so forth, but they can't be people who have histories of, like, fighting against the country. They need to, like, prove that they are really willing to get, in the test they have to undergo. Do you know that they have to actually learn a bit of the history, and they have to take the oath? When they become citizens, they take an oath. And that's very much of how the biblical texts are doing this. Rahab takes kind of an oath. And you're right. The problem of xenophobia is a huge one in the Bible. But going back to our point is they're trying to survive after defeat. They're not trying to do a thing like in Germany in the 19th century in Fichte, saying, Germans, the folk, we have it in our blood. We shouldn't allow anything to be contaminated. We as the people will go forward. Why? Because that's about militarization and conquest and asserting one's one's superiority. This is a community that is trying to survive the loss of all that. And if people want to join them, then it's like, yes, all the better. We need more. If you want to join us, we're not going to, we need to survive. And that's why it also, the question of women. Women are in a state period of a kingdom with great militaries and so forth. They're kept back, and their job is to produce soldiers who can fight. That's their roles are reduced to maternity, to motherhood. When the state is defeated, and you're a small people, you can't do that with women. They're not trying to produce soldiers with them. They're trying to give women a new role in society. That's where education comes in. They need to be given some place so that all hands can be on deck. They can't exclude 50% of the population. And that's why women are actually, in contrary to the conception of the Bible as kind of a misogynist text, there's lots of problems with how they treat women, but like the Rahab story in the books of Genesis, all these matriarchs, and they're trying to show that women are central to our identity and have a central public role to play because it's about survival. It's not about trying to create armies.
Now, does the Bible give a strategy? Does it prescribe a way to survive? Because on the one hand, like, we do see this, we see both sides of this, where it can be something that's incredibly insular, right? Where, like you're saying, it's about loyalty, it's about being part of this group, and real, because we need to survive. But the other side, which I think we also see, is like, well, if you're not in a state you're the dominant nation, you can also be incredibly cosmopolitan. And I'm up by New York right now, and we have both of those on a daily basis, where you have this incredible cosmopolitanism in which Judaism flows like water. It's part of the stream. And you also have communities that are just completely sealed off from the secular world, as it were.
Yeah.
Is this something that is sort of discussed, or is it just what we've been talking about so far, which is like how you transmit this peoplehood from this time in the past to the point from when you create it to the point in the past into the future? How do we preserve this?
It has to be. I think Judaism, later Rabbinic Judaism, talks about this as a Eitz Chaim, a living tree, a growing tree, and it has to be flexible. And you can't be insulars. Those insular communities of Jews, ultra-Orthodox, they are about survival, but it's a very tenuous survival, and there has to be an openness toward the other. There has to be the ability to be flexible and to adapt and to grow. And so the idea is not just survival. It is the mandate that Abraham receives and Sarah receives is to be a blessing. And it is there to be a light on the hill, right? And a city on the hill, or a light to the nations, and all that kind of stuff. And that's picked up and applied to America and with political purposes. But the whole idea is what's going to give us purpose in a future is not that we're going to pull back and become political quietists who want to be insular and afraid of cosmopolitanism and the world at whole. We have as we become together and we focus on education, we focus on being a healthy people, we are going to bring blessing. It's a religious term, right? But bless world, and having that mandate is so important to kind of inspire the people to do something. And without it, if it's all just about survival, it's not gonna go very far. And it's just preservation and conservatism, and that's gonna die out. Young generations want to be able to like take what they've received and then do something creative with it. And the whole idea behind the Hebrew Bible is that other nations will find their way, and that we'll all turn our swords into plowshares and live peace next to each other, rather than trying to have one empire that's going to conquer us all, and that we all have to become Starbucks. And rather, we want to have individual cafes, and there's a nice competition, and you can go here and there, and we're not going to collapse our differences.
And then how has this been received by both academics and
macadamia nuts,
academia nuts, and Christians and Jews and religious people in general? How do
It's been weird, because I thought when I wrote the book that it was not. I knew it would be received by guys like you, Todd, and Nathan, and so forth. I knew I was writing the book for people outside the fold, if you will, like myself and me. But it's strange. I mean, a lot of believers, a lot of people who love the Bible as scripture and so forth, like come at this and say, that helps me understand this. It's not necessarily going to destroy my faith. It expands it. And that's what I'm trying to get, in a certain sense, non-believers and so forth to appreciate this as just a great work of literature and as a political project. And what is really problematic is when the Bible is just left to religious people. It's too important to leave to religious people. This is this is an amazing corpus of literature. Absolutely. And it's literature kind of in the first, it's an invention of literature in our sense, right? You have these texts from ancient Near East that are shared among scribes, but the enjoyment of reading, the pleasure of reading, and all of that, if we love books, we need to study the making of this corpus of books, and it can't be just about scripture. It can't be just about theology and God. God may play a role in it, but I compare God in many of these texts to the flag in America or in Canada or in England, right? What is it? It's a transcendent thing that's going to unify us so that we don't have to worry about whether it's Trump or Biden or something, all these factions we can say. There's a flag above us, and that's where we need to think about. We need to think about that kind of unity a more perfect union. And so having the role of this God is about having a transcendent point of unity. And that's a very political project. And that needs to be appreciated as such, rather than it's all about God and worshiping God and so forth. That's really not what the biblical authors are after.
It's just a side effect.
It's complicated, right? There is the narrative is very much about the relationship between the people and this God, and it's the story of this developing relationship. This God is the kind of the husband, and the people is his wife, and this God is abusive. He's really abusive, and they have a divorce. The divorce is defeat. The prophets depict that defeat as a divorce, and they call out and say, "You have abused us. It's not like we've only done wrong and you're the right one," and so forth. They call out and they lament and they scream and holler. They say, "Wake up! What are you doing? You're supposed to fill your end of the bargain." So it is a. I don't want to diminish that. It is a story of this relationship between a God and the people, but it's not the kind of universal God who there's only one God kind of thing. They think of all their nations having their gods, and I would say, like with this, Martha Nussbaum is this philosopher at the University of Chicago, and she teaches Greek literature like Homer and so forth. And Homer has a lot of Zeus in it, right? And that doesn't mean that when she reads this that they all have to like become Zeus believers. They recognize how Zeus functions in the narrative. And in the narrative of the Bible, God's a character. It's a personality. And it's one part of a relationship. And it's not the kind of theistic. The Bible's not theistic. The Bible is story. And theism is a philosophy. And no one, I don't really, whatever, you get it.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of see, I don't know. I was raised on more Star Wars than Bible. And I'm starting to think maybe it's doing the same thing. It does unite people in the same way.
It does. And I would say that from the perspective of historians and scholars of religion, many of our students are studying baseball as religion, and and football. What's the religion of America? It's the NFL and the Super Bowl, and there's the rituals behind it, and the team, and all of that. And you tell religious people that, and they get very offended. But it's very strange that some of the most conservative Christians are also the most avid NFL followers. It goes hand in hand, this kind of devotion, devotion to a cause, and rituals and superstitions around what one can do during this. All of that, and that's helpful, I think, to kind of normalize how we think about religion and to make it be something less than just about theism.
Yeah, and they both fill up a few hours on Sundays.
Yes, they compete with each other.
Or cooperate, I guess. There's no counter programming. It starts a little later. With that in mind, are you ready to move on to the lightning round of Can a True Atheist? I don't know how well this applies to you, but we'll just assume it's going to work.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'll put it this way. Sometimes, I wake up and it's, where do I stand on these things?
Yeah.
I'm fluid on this.
Well, Jacob, let's jump into the first one.
Let's try. I don't know how this works.
It's a yes or no question, but you can elaborate on your answer. So we'll start with an easy one. Can a true atheist believe in God? Simple yes or no question with an explanation.
I think a true atheist believes in God in a certain sense. I'll say yes. And let me just elaborate on that. In many ways, and I hope I don't offend you all, but atheists are actually, they need this God in order to deny that. I'm stepping on some feet there. But some of the atheists I know were like the most fervent believers, and then they leave that, and they need that religion in order to have another.
No, it's it's the question we get the most diverse answers to. It's really bizarre, but yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Can a totally different theme? Can a true atheist worry that we live in a computer simulation?
Um, I guess yes. I don't. This is difficult for me. By the way, I'm going to ask something. Do you guys know Francesca Stavrakopoulos?
Yeah, I think I've heard of her. She wrote a book called like God, just God. Is that?
God, an anatomy. She's a leading atheist in the UK. You should have her on. And she belongs to different societies and she debates folks. And she's a good Hebrew Bible scholar who's like an avowed atheist. And he knows a lot about these things. I'm not, I don't belong to an atheist group or anything like that. So this is kind of new for me. I really don't care about it all. I'll have to put it that way. I don't care about atheism. I don't care about theism. I do care about political community,
Yeah.
getting our shit together.
Yeah. Is there a label that you identify with that we can
I'm
use
Jewish,
for this?
and many Jews are atheists, or many Jews
Mm,
actually don't care about God.
yeah.
Like when I'm teaching in a seminary, we're looking at text in the Bible, and they're like, "Well, where's God in this text?" And I say, "There is no God in this text." It's about like how one treats and all these kinds of issues, and it's the assumption is that everything has to be about God. And for Jews in the Old Testament, and so forth, God is not that important. I know that's going to step on some toes, but
Well, okay, here's another one. Can a true atheist follow religious dietary customs or perhaps reject religious dietary customs?
oh yes, they can. They can follow them and they can reject them. But because dietary customs are originally not linked to God at all, and they were very much about survival and about ethnic boundaries and all kinds of stuff. And only later does it become religious law.
Well, I mean, but that's part of what's being constructed, though, right? Is that those religious customs then become part of that identity, and you can't break them without exiting that identity, right? Then you
Not
are disloyal.
necessarily. I mean, there are many Jews who eat shrimp, right? And
It
they
is
call them
tasty.
Jews. So it's what does it mean to be Jewish? It's a very difficult thing to define. So Jewishness is about peoplehood. It's not about God. It's not about religion. Religion can play a role in it.
I mean, is one of the things that we have to do now, because I mean, I get like there are a couple things I see in your project. One is that like, wow, this is really a remarkable text that did this. It held a people together and it somehow transmitted cultural practices for thousands of years over the entire earth. And that's something absolutely remarkable. But there's another part where it's like, well, how do we, how do we adopt this to what we see as our problems? And also, how do we avoid sort of the pitfalls with things like this, where we get these big disagreements? Does that make sense?
Yes, and maybe your question is also this: can this project work without God?
It might be. Yeah.
I think that's a good question. It's one that I struggle with because, having a personal relationship between a people and this deity who has this personality and sometimes mistreats you and all of that is more interesting than just like this flag. What does the flag do? The flag is waves in the air, and it's hard to kind of have a relationship with the flag. But nevertheless, I think it can work, and I think that's what the biblical authors would have wanted us to do. I was talking to Nathan before the show, and if these scribes if we could believe in the resurrection, and these scribes were to live again today, they would come back and say, "What are you guys doing reading our text? Why haven't you created new Bibles? In our own time, we did something innovative. We used technology to connect people and to create new reading communities. What does that look like in your own age? Why are you just following along us?" Now, I'm not trying to say that what they established is all defunct and we don't need to read this anymore and learn from it, but we need to learn from it and apply it to new projects. And so I'm all about trying to write new Bibles. And I train my students in a seminary to say, let's learn how not just to read the Bible, but how to write the Bible. How do you write
Right.
biblical text?
All right. Yeah.
It
So,
doesn't
yeah.
God, it can be with nuns, and not the big project among the nuns is how do we create a non-confessional Bible? How do we learn from like the poetry and the proverbs and all the songs and stuff? Can we do something for our own communities?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Without a coercive state, which I think is also one of the interesting, attractive parts of the project that you've tapped into, right? Recognizing that they're temporary.
Without the institutions, without the support, it's really, in a certain sense, it's about how do you mobilize people without having some form of coercion. When you have in a certain sense, established religion has their means of coercion. And when you start forming a new community, whether it's a community of atheists or a community of nuns or a community of a book club, how do you get people to come together around that free willingly? How do you excite their curiosity? Because I think that's what the biblical project is about, is not coercion as much as like the book of Esther that we go in the Purim that's going to be celebrated. It has nothing whatsoever to do with God. There are books in the Bible that never mention God. They take God completely out of the picture, and they try to say, does this project of peoplehood work without God? And according to Esther, it does. It's solidarity and working together and having not a man on the throne like King David, but a queen who was married to the foreign emperor, and learning to kind of survive in a form that that doesn't have God at the center, not waiting for God to kind of intervene. And that's so important for these authors to show. You need to make place in your community for people who aren't down with God, because it's about getting the people together, not about getting the people together around God.
Well, I think that answers a few more questions that we never got to. Nathan?
Yeah.
What else?
Yeah. Let's just kind of continue on wrapping up on our lightning round. Well, can a true atheist or can a true Jew say "God bless you" when someone sneezes?
Ooh.
Do
Yeah.
Jews say that? God bless you.
Well, we say Gesundheit, which is
Okay.
Yiddish or German.
Right.
But
Yes.
yes, you can. Yes, you can. I love like using some religious language. I say like we're gonna have a come to Jesus talk. I'm a Jew.
Yes.
I know. I know.
Well, come to Jesus talk is kind of fun, or glory hallelujah and kinds of things. It works really well. Or praise be.
Mm,
Amen.
yes.
Amen to
Yeah,
that.
right. Yes.
Okay. Well, with that said, can a true atheist find solace in prayer?
I think so, yeah. What is prayer? Prayer can be the various forms of meditation. You can pray to yourself. You can pray in a way that connects with nature. There's all forms of prayer. It's really just being attuned and being present and being mindful. And so, yeah, I mean, the daily Calm app or whatever it's called, it's like, yes, that's a form of prayer. And I think I would urge you to think about it in those terms, that don't allow all these concepts to be co-opted by theists, if you will. It's like, don't allow the nation to be co-opted by nationalists. Take it back.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe this will be the last one. Can a true atheist find wisdom in the Bible? I think I know the answer.
Definitely. That's what I tried to show, and I'm so glad that it's like hitting hard and good. And you have like the New Yorker and all your podcasts, like your own or authors.
We're up there with the New Yorker. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And trying to make this this is a work of the human spirit, and it needs to be appreciated as that. And I want to help atheists and non-religious people. And I had a course, and it's still ongoing. It's called The Bible's Prehistory, Purpose, and Political Future, and it students from all over the world, Muslims and people, atheists in China and all kinds of stuff who are taking it. They don't care about the Bible as religious scripture. They want to know, what the hell is this thing about? It's kind of interesting. And yes, they find meaning in it like we find meaning in Homer, right? We don't have to believe to read Homer.
No, it's such a refreshing perspective on it that we don't, especially in the U.S. now, where the dominant view, like socially, and through mass media and depictions of the U.S., the dominant view we get of the Bible is that it is the word of God and it is 100% absolutely true, and you need to obey it or go to hell. It's sort of in the water here.
Yeah.
And to be able to talk about it in any other way, is a tremendous relief. And to
I thought that it would
about it and to think about it in this way, which is completely novel. And I had never thought of it this way, and I'd never seen it in the text. But it's like now.
I thought that really people would not like this because, and let me put it this way. I don't have fundamentalists and evangelicals liking the book necessarily.
No.
But there are people of faith who like it.
Mm.
I thought that, and I think they understand why it can be interesting to other people. But if you're a fundamentalist and evangelical and a Bible thumping kind of Christian, or a Jew for that matter, you're not going to ever want the text to be appreciated as literature.
Right. Yeah.
Just like if you're a Muslim, you don't want to have the Quran read by non-Muslims as literature. It's they always say the Holy Quran, and that's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. We have to, wherever we are, either atheist or a scholar like myself, take that back. This is too important of stuff to leave to people who are religious.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. We say that a lot. We don't often say it about the Bible, though.
The Bible. I'm trying to the Bible even.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Jacob, this has been absolutely fascinating, and we could go for another hour. I still have a lot of questions.
Well, I'll come back on sometime with you guys. If you want.
No, that'd be great.
Yeah, please keep us up to date with other projects you're doing, because I'm sure your classes sound amazing as well.
I'm writing a book now on the future or the invention of hope.
Oh, nice.
Also with biblical roots?
I'm trying to do all kinds of like Stoics and and all kinds of non-religious stuff, and trying to how do we have hope in a world where we don't believe that God controls it all?
Right. Yeah. It's a fascinating topic. My God, so much good stuff. All right. Well, that's
thank you, guys.
Full Professor Jacob Wright of Emory University, author of Why the Bible Began. It's a fascinating story. Thank you so much, Jacob.
I appreciate it, guys.
Okay, that was Jacob Wright. It was really interesting talking with him. Todd, what did you take away from that conversation?
It's a fantastic study. He makes some excellent points. There are a few things we didn't talk about, that we didn't get into, that I'm not convinced on. But I like the big idea that he was really impressing upon us is how this corpus was used to create peoplehood. And I think that is a fantastic finding. And whether or not it is intentional, we didn't get into that.
Yeah.
But whether or not it is intentional, did have that result, right? You can prove, it's very clear that it had that result.
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. And it really throws a sharp relief into what we think of as how nationalism develops. Because it doesn't have a lot of those elements, right? But they still manage to do it.
Yeah.
The point that he made, it's about a defeated people, which, by the way, is something universal. We shouldn't lose sight of that. When you talk about the Syrians and Babylonians and Cana, even Romans, right? All of these empires came and went.
Right.
They're all gone. So that idea of the view from a defeated people, every region of the earth is a defeated empire, right? But they don't have these lasting legacies. That's
that
fascinating.
is a good
Like,
point.
this is the way that it was allowed to persist. We don't know how many were lost along the way, but this is one that persisted, and that I think is fascinating on its own. So that's really, really cool. And there's a lot of knock-on effects there, but I'm coming at this from a position of like political philosophy and politics and really like the sort of material aspects of it. I'm curious just like what you thought of historically. What did you think of the historicity of it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think your points are really, really interesting. And I agree with what you're saying. Um, and I think like it makes a lot of sense to me too, the arguments. And I think like the thing that was valuable for me was that, atheists or whatever can can appreciate it. Like, and
Right.
I think that's what he's trying to do, like to say there's value in this tradition. We can, it's quite it should be studied like, in the same way, I don't know, like the ancient Greeks, their accomplishments or whatever, like it's just like a human achievement, and
And
you don't need to bring in divine language or whatever to explain, like there's no kind of divine nature to any of these writings or whatever. It's just the product of the human spirit, or like, spirit, like in
yeah,
nations. But so I think that's one thing. Like as a kind of feat of human beings, it's quite unique to put together this like lasting corpus of works that really, I mean, like uniquely have stood the test of time for many centuries. And I think that's, even though we don't think there's anything to the kind of supernatural elements, I think it's still, there's still a lot of valuable stuff there. I mean, like there's so many, as you mentioned, like so many different things that could be addressed. One thing that was interesting to me is, this kind of comparison with nationalism, like of the kind of more modern nationalism that we see like in the 19th century. And one thing that was kind of interesting, and like we might have explored it, is like kind of the links with anti-Semitism and within these new nation states, because in a way, the fact that like Jews were, kind of a people without a state meant that they kind of fit uneasily in these new nations, where like in like a Germany or something like that, which is, trying to build this national state or nation state, like the Jews are not, they're not seen as like real Germans, quote unquote. And it's
or in
because
France or in
yes, that's
Russia.
right. That's right. Because they, there are people who don't have ties to a state necessarily. And so I think that's kind of an interesting point, like the way peoplehood runs up against nationalism in that way and kind of contributes to anti-Semitism.
Right. That
Um,
kind of othering, you
yes,
know,
that's right.
right.
Yes. And so, yeah. And I mean, I think yeah, I think that's an interesting thing that I was thinking about. Yeah.
Right. It does. And I think he's right in the sense of like, look, if you go and look at this and just not even just the book, his work mostly focuses on the book and how the book does this, how the Bible, the Tanakh, the early Testament does this. He's saying like, if you go through and look at it, it's like we can draw secular lessons from establishing a people without the state. And there's something really fascinating there because, and again, this wasn't addressed. We would really need to know more about this. Is like, how do you do it in the absence of a centralized authority? Because there
Yeah.
must be
Yeah.
one of the
Yeah.
things that isn't addressed is like this book is not, it doesn't come together organically, magically by itself, right? There's a lot of picking
Mm,
and choosing. How do you
yes.
order the book? How do you,
Mm,
right? Inside Judaism, there's a whole separate history of how you discuss this. You
mm-hmm.
Talmud after that, and then it's like, and there are different sets, so it doesn't create this unified monolith. It doesn't have a centralized authority, but it does create enough of a cohesion.
Yeah, that's right.
And right, so okay, we can do it through some form of literature, some form of cultural artifact, let's say. Like we're thinking secularly, how do we promote a secular worldview that creates a people who are secular? Okay, so we have this kind of artifact, it has to have this kind of idea. We're not sure how to centralize it, but you can do it without a state. All of this is like, that's really attractive. And you can very simply, building off this, just imagine it. It immediately leads to, well, you got to make sure everybody can read. You've got to make sure everybody can understand. You've got to make sure everybody can engage in it, right? It's got to be something approachable. Very different from Christianity, where it was this sort of elite.
That's right.
You couldn't have the language until Protestantism, and then then it becomes part of the vernacular, and you can engage in it, right? So you have to have something that people can engage. So all of this, I think, is really fantastic, and it does kind of speak to some of what we know now. And I'm curious if you see it this way. One of the things that made me think is there is already a secular canon, right? And there is a Western, at least in the U.S., there is definitely this canon, but it's elite, it's esoteric. It might as well be a cult, right? Like, it's very strange when you get to.
What are you referring to in particular?
Like Locke and Mill.
Okay, right.
Federalists, Frederick Douglass, the Seneca Falls. I mean, these are definitely parts of the Western canon, but they don't know them. If you go and ask a Trump supporter about gun regulation, be like, look, this is my property and it's fine if I don't hurt anybody, right? If you take that, right, if you bring that to, someone who's been through grad school, they're going to cite Locke and they're going to cite Mill.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
And it's really what that notion is built on, right? We have this vague understanding, but we don't have that. We didn't bring it in from that corpus, which is already there and pre-existing.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right.
Right. And we don't engage with it, right? We treat the Constitution as kind of this, unchangeable, immutable, sacred script that nobody actually reads or realizes it's been changed beyond recognition. But people aren't really taught to engage with everything behind it, right? We don't encourage sort of literacy. We don't encourage that kind of discussion. So in the absence of, we do have a canon there. I think it's there. The public canon is just, part of it is that in the absence of a centralized authority that tells you what it's going to be, it becomes a struggle, right? And we see that. We've seen that in the US in like school board meetings where people are fighting over to include. That's what happens.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess you could make parallels with Judaism or any other kind of religion where there's pretty much as wide of a spectrum of, beliefs, of interpretations, like as possible, right? Really.
Yeah.
And sharing the same kind of, central texts or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just how you interpret them different.
And I think it was where Jacob started with it, was like, why, like, if you talk to Paul of, formerly Saul of Tarsus, he's not going to say that he's writing the Bible. Right. He's right. He's just interpreting it or something. But what you get out of that is a new Bible. You get a new part of the Bible. That's what it becomes. It's kind of like, fan fiction becoming canon, right? Like if 50 Shades of Grey became part of
Twilight. No, wait, it's Twilight. Yeah.
Twilight, like how Twilight led to 50 Shades of Grey. They're kind of it's fan fiction. Christianity is kind of fan fiction. Everybody who wrote it was Jewish, right? Everybody who lived it was Jewish.
Yes. That's right. Yeah.
And you don't have control over that. You don't.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think one other thing I was thinking of that kind of like about the kind of canon or whatever. I think at some point in the interview, like you mentioned, like Star Wars and these sort of like, well-known stories that people, many people have watched or whatever, and there's been all sorts of related works written about it and so on. But I think like, if someone for 500 years from now is kind of looking back at our society, like these sorts of works like express like values that we hold, I guess, like, obviously we don't think like Luke Skywalker or whatever actually exists or anything like that, but like, like the works, I think, they're so popular because they express like certain
It
values and so on that our
mm,
society holds. And
right, the hero's journey.
yes, right, exactly. Yeah, that's right. I mean, who knows whether any of this sort of Star Wars or whatever
Yeah,
carries
right, and
on.
yeah,
But I
and
think
like
yeah.
yeah, one of the things that's weird about Star Wars is like um, Lucas was trying to make a libertarian fantasy, and it just a
Mm,
lot of that got cut out, and it was really remade in editing. So it's kind of a collective work, but like
right.
the death of the author is also in there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Where
right.
culture kind of takes over.
Mhm.
So anytime like when you do intentionally create this stuff, it's not always that message that's going to be received, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good point.
So, like, I mean, so the big takeaway for me from this is like, yes, this is an astounding story. I do really enjoy what he's telling, and I find like some of the results shocking but inarguable. But interpreting it for what we want in a secular society, it's like, okay, this is definitely a piece. It's not every piece. It's not everything. It's necessary but not sufficient, right?
Yeah, I think it speaks to like this issue of like how do you build a community, and like obviously that's something we're thinking about. I mean, I guess one other thing is like building a community, what sort of values do you hold and so on. And if it's like if it's too broad of you're trying to capture too broad of a group, then you wind up then what's the point of joining the community?
Right. Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing. Other than just like, I mean, I think it's like establishing a tradition. Obviously, like with Judaism, when you join that, or that, if you're born into it, or if you know, voluntarily join, like, you're joining a, thousands of years old tradition.
All right. Yeah.
Whereas it's
Um,
hard to just invent a new tradition out of nothing. So
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, obviously. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's like there's a ton to think about with his book and his ideas. And you can go down all sorts of tangents. I think that's really
Totally. And
valuable.
it does
Yeah.
remind me one of the things we haven't discussed in this is like atheist art and
Mm,
TV literature and stuff. Like
yeah.
right. And it's out there. It's just not doesn't
Yeah.
have the same.
Yes. I mean, like an interesting thing, like going back to the issue of intentionality, like, many of these, scribes or whatever who are writing this stuff, like again, they're probably not thinking like we're gonna make a work of that's central to the Jewish people. Like, like they didn't maybe think of it in those terms. So I think that could be something about art that we make today, or we being like atheists or whatever. It's like, we don't know how future people may use it or whatever. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it may also tell us something that is missing from the things that are produced today. Because
Hmm.
it does kind of answer a question of like, in the US, one of the big things is like we don't have very strong class consciousness. It just doesn't exist in the
Hmm.
US. And
Hmm.
it's always one of those things it's tough to ask because you can't really answer a negative question. Why didn't this happen?
Hmm.
But people who are class conscious or like of the left are aware of a lot of that history. Like they were historical touchstones. There's art and literature and movies, and there's stuff that's about that. It's just not well appreciated. It's not produced very much. And like one of and we're kind of seeing it um these days in the US where like that the far right, it's like we know what some of those touchstones are. We know what some of
Yeah,
the books
that's true.
are, what
Yes.
classics are, what are like the big moments in the far right history. The most recent one being January 6th, but you go back to Oklahoma and Ruby Ridge and all this.
Right. Right.
Like it's being defined as we're going through it.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
there's not, like there's not that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe like, what is the thing that you can attach to it, but that makes it something people can connect? Yeah, I don't know, but it's great thought piece. Super interesting, and the book itself is incredibly detailed. I think he goes through like book by book of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very serious scholarship. Great, and a great
Yes.
historical context as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah. Just it always gets the brain juices flowing, doesn't it, Nathan?
Yeah. And I think that's
That's the
a sign
problem.
of
Think,
a good book when like it causes you to think in all sorts of causes you to think about many things that even like, maybe he's not directly intending people to think about, but like there's just so much there that you can kind of build
yeah,
on or
yeah,
whatever. So
yeah.
yeah.
Super fun to think about this one. Yeah, why are we doing anything, Nathan? We can read books, we can think so hard, and yet what are we
Yeah.
doing? Right?
Yes.
Well, we
Yeah.
both work in education and we both teach
Yeah.
people.
That's
So there
right.
you go. We're doing
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
We're building the canon. We're teaching people
That's
to
right.
think. We're doing it every day.
Yeah.
And just
That's
like
right.
all our listeners, they're getting it done.
Yeah. All
So
right. So
there's,
yes. So we encourage people to check out the book. It's called Why the Bible Began, an Alternative History of Scripture and Its Origins.
yeah, big ups. Nathan, what have you got going on? You're on all the internets these days. You're on all the apps. What do you,
Yeah. I'm on
what do
I'm trying to get more active on Blue Sky,
you,
which is
ooh,
kind of like I think it's created by the guy who originally made Twitter. And it's like meant to be a more like inviting place than Twitter is these days. So I'm trying to go on there now.
is it
Although
still decentralized?
this
Is
is
it
like
invitation only?
no, it's they actually opened it up to everyone now.
Fantastic. And how do
Yeah.
people find you on this?
I don't even know what I think my handle or whatever is the same. Although I could no, I think it's different. I think it's like nathan.ga.alexander or something at Blue Sky. I don't know. I'm not
It'll
sure,
be linked
which is
below.
not
You
terribly
can check
useful.
them out. Any
Yes.
complaints about the show, be sure to address there.
Yeah.
And of course, all the likes and the love mail. We don't
Mhm.
get too much hate mail, but the love mail,
Oh,
we
yeah, that's great.
appreciate that too. Yeah, love hearing from everybody. Big ups to the fans. Thank you to Red Japan for the intro music. Of course, if you're ever in LA or if you're not in LA, actually all of California now, I think Atheists United, they're reaching out, they're growing. We're on their radio network, so check them out. Pitch them some ducats. I think they use that in California. It's California. And I think that's it till next time. Bye-bye.
Till next time.